I grew up watching Star Trek, like the original Star Trek. Ever since I knew what space was, I wanted to do nothing but explore it. I watched movies about witty heroes jumping around the universe meeting new aliens every week in their crazy looking ships, and I was enthralled, as I'm sure many of you were as well. But as much as fiction shapes what we pursue for our futures, it's rarely an exact image of that future. After all, the communicators from Star Trek transformed into smartphones that do 1,000 times more than their sci-fi equivalents. And if fiction has anything to say about what our futures will most probably contain, it's personal starships. So what would they look like? What could they do, and how likely is it that humanity could enjoy trips to space on their own time and with their own equipment? How close are we to becoming the people we write about, with limitless freedom to explore? Welcome back to Sirius Science, and this is the science behind personal starships. I'm going to start by setting a correct expectation in one aspect. While I've done a particularly successful video explaining how we could travel faster than light, that technology is dependent on properties of physics that are currently still theoretical. By all accounts, the universe disallows faster than light travel by the very nature of mass energy and physics. We still may be able to find a way around this limitation, but that possibility remains to be seen. So, as for now, our vision of personal starships will be sublight ones that travel either close to or far beneath the speed of light. Until we are able to create and recreate warped sections of space-time, we will have to look to a much slower version of the future. But this doesn't mean our ships will be any less amazing. If travel times between stars and planets really must be measured in years as opposed to the near-instant speeds of FTL, then our ships must become bigger, stronger, and capable of supporting life just as well as our own planet does. So where do we begin with our theories about what these ships will look like? Well, what would we need them to do? If commercial starships become available for the public to purchase and pilot themselves, our world will need to look far different to what it does today. First of all, the cost of not only the technology needed to get to space, but the cost of fuel for these ships and the necessity for mass space transit must be developed. The only real reason the public would need access to their own starships is if they were used to reach work-related destinations, and would need to do so on a regular basis. Say someone needs to show up to a moon base that processes aluminum for return to Earth's industrial sectors, or even orbital factories. It takes about 3 days of coasting to reach the moon, but this is done using the least amount of fuel and without much regard for time. If a ship were to burn towards the moon at a constant rate and then turn around to reverse their speed halfway through the trip, our ship could reach the moon in under a day, a travel time equivalent to an intercontinental flight. Our theoretical future person needs to fly to the moon at the beginning of every week to supervise and program the drones used in the lunar collection and refining processes, and returns to Earth for the weekend. This person is joined by millions of other humans traveling to dozens of other destinations all across the solar system, and not always on the surface of a planet. This outward colonization and exploitation of our astral resources would create the necessity for mass transit vehicles, but the initial version of these ships would be more akin to buses or airplanes than personal cars. As if a group is traveling to the moon all at once, it costs far less to put them all on one transport than to sell them dozens of ships, dozens of times more fuel, and monitor all of those ships all vying for landing and takeoff time slots. Eventually, as people begin to spend more time in space than they do here on Earth, the market for such ships will literally take off. For this to happen though, the cost of everything needed to construct and fly these ships will need to be affordable to consumers, meaning we have a lot of work to do with not only our material conquests, but also the quality of life for all humans. So say we have the need for and the ability to mass produce these ships. Well, what would they look like? Ships used just for human transport or personal pleasure would be much like the sedans and smaller cars we use today. They have little cargo space compared to trucks or semis, but are built around comfort and affordability. No sports car is designed for carrying large cargo, and no delivery van has an engine that goes from 0 to 60 in a second. So, when ships meant for personal pleasure are created, they will most likely be smaller machines, capable of carrying anywhere from one human to a family, and doing so in comfort. They may host the most luxury features of the majority of other ships, and will be made fast and sleek. These lower-end usage ships will most likely look like what we envisioned personal starships to be, the size of small aircraft designed to look as cool as possible while keeping its occupants as comfortable as possible. But they will be limited as to what they can do as well as how far they can travel, as the smaller a ship gets, the less fuel it can take with it. These pleasure craft will be among the first selections the average Joe will be shown, but the size of a ship brings benefits. For one, ramming into space debris at hypersonic speeds is a lot less painful with a thick heavy shield mounted to your nose, and has the capability to do less damage to a larger armored ship. These bigger models will most likely be used for a multitude of reasons: ferrying cargo between worlds, ensnaring asteroids for mining, carrying large groups of people, and even acting as small factories for landing on a virgin world and beginning the process of manufacturing a colony. These ships will probably be seen most in the employ of companies or independent contractors, as they serve more of an industrial purpose than personal ones. These slightly larger cargo-based ships may be the most common seen if space-based industry becomes our main source of power in a new interplanetary economy. But of course, the real fun begins when we go even bigger. There really is no limit to how large we could build ships, from the size of aircraft carriers to the size of planets. These ships will probably never become available to anyone but the hyper-wealthy or corporations due to their sheer sizes and purpose. These ultramassive ships would be capable of pretty much anything, like carrying entire colonies to other worlds or traveling between stars. When designing a ship that needs to be as Earth-like as possible for its crew, bigger is always better. These ships could house more hydroponics, reactors, and spin gravity housing than any of the smaller sized vehicles could. Bigger ships can also carry more armor, which is useful for long trips spent traveling incredible distances. These ships could take on many shapes. If one needs to land and take off from a planet as part of its operations, it could be made long and aerodynamic, looking much like the concepts for fancy mega cruisers we have today. If the ship stays in place and releases other smaller ships for more maneuverable journeys, they could look like pencil-thin pillars of housing and cargo space. These giant ships can also serve a more refined purpose, carrying thousands of people to destinations in a cruise liner-like luxury. These space yachts could be the pinnacle of wealth, being massive enough to be fully independent on their travels, as well as sporting some of the most exclusive technologies of the time. But in order to even begin building these personal starships, we will need to make major advancements in several areas, particularly power generation and storage. Right now, our best batteries are less efficient at storing energy than wood. Yeah, pretty terrible, but a good start. We've done some experimenting with graphene and carbon nanotubes by combining them with different elements, and have begun creating some impressive materials capable of acting as batteries hundreds of times better than what we have. But these graphene batteries are still very much in development. There are some batteries available for purchasing today that include graphene in their structures, but they act more as an insulation around the parts of a battery that we have been using already for decades now. Plus, graphene is extremely difficult to produce, costing about $1,000 per gram. Even if a single AA battery was made entirely off of this hyper-efficient material, that one battery would cost as much as a car. Not exactly what I was talking about when I said these technologies need to be affordable to the common person for personal starships to emerge. But storing energy is just the half of what we need aboard these vessels. We also need to produce it. The first of these machines may simply rely on charged batteries or solar power for this energy, but will need to improve massively for us to use them in an interplanetary fashion, let alone interstellar ones. For ships needing large amounts of power to function, they must be made big enough to house reactors. These reactors may be nuclear in nature, but even this technology needs improvement. We are shrinking the size of such reactors, but at a cost of how much power they can produce. Only the larger ships would be able to house these reactors as of right now, but I doubt our improvements to power generation will stop anytime in the near future. But why would a ship need large amounts of electrical power in the first place? Isn't thrust power the important part? Well, it's true that large and powerful engines will be needed to get anywhere within a reasonable amount of time, but these engines themselves may operate using electricity. The ion engines of today take large amounts of electricity and use the charges of ionized gases by accelerating the particles of gas in an electromagnetic field. Ion drives are extremely efficient and sport the highest exhaust velocity of any fuel we have today. But these engines are slow, being used most often in deep space when a craft can afford to make small maneuvers to adjust a larger trajectory. We want our engines to have high efficiency, high exhaust velocity, and lots of power. Ion engines offer all but the latter. If we could improve the power of such engines, they could become the de facto methods of travel. But there are other theoretical engines that would use electricity to fly, mostly in the realm of fusion-based drives. Fusion power has been on our horizon for quite some time, always seeming to crawl forwards towards no particular success. Though there are fusion reactors today that can create positive energy outputs, however small. The problem is that it takes more or an equal amount of power to start a fusion reaction than what we get from that reaction. But fusion tech would offer an incredible boost in power, as it uses hydrogen and other plentiful elements as fuel and offers no danger should a meltdown occur, as the process would simply fizzle out and leave nothing but heat should the reactor fail. These fusion drives would be able to accelerate matter through our improvised ion drives, or could even fire the materials used in the reaction out of a nozzle at speeds close to that of light. There are even better ways to produce both thrust and energy, but all of which are still in design. The most commonly known would be antimatter drives. Antimatter is a material we have both produced and captured here on Earth, but has only done so in tiny amounts which last for only a few moments, and use gigantic particle accelerators to produce, which take up large amounts of power themselves. Antimatter combines with an equal amount of regular matter to convert both entirely into energy. This is one of the most efficient fuels, as all of the material is used in the energy creation process, but it is also extremely volatile, as the fuel tanks we produce here on Earth are always made of, well, common matter, which annihilates itself when it comes into contact with antimatter. We have been able to store particles of antimatter briefly within strong magnetic fields, but we will need to do better when creating systems that will use these antiparticles. We also have to solve the problem of how difficult it is to produce antimatter in any useful quantity. One of the largest and most stable theoretical reactors we have imagined would be black hole drives. These would secure a miniature black hole, which we currently have no idea how to make by the way, using magnetic fields, while also feeding the black hole small amounts of matter. While the black hole feeds, it would blast radiation from its poles, which could be used to excite materials into releasing electricity. Black holes release much of this radiation as gamma, which we also have no idea how to collect, as gamma radiation passes through pretty much everything besides lead or meters of concrete. Other issues standing in the way of personal starships we have already solved. Gravity, for instance, is vital for life as we know it. Without gravity, the skeleton erodes, muscles weaken, and organs like the heart and eyes begin to fail after long exposures to zero-G. This issue can be solved using rotating sections of habitats to produce spin gravity equivalent of that of Earth's. Those smaller ships would most likely be unable to fit something large enough to produce spin gravity, and may be relegated to short uses. Air and water recycling have been reliably mastered ever since the space race, and we can confidently say that these resources won't be an issue, as water can be found just about everywhere in the universe and can also be electronically separated into hydrogen and oxygen. Food, on the other hand, will prove more difficult to grow aboard a starship if that ship is undertaking a long mission, while the crew is still awake and needs to eat. This issue is not far from vanishing, as we have experimented with space agriculture before on the ISS with resounding success. We now know that plants can grow in space, even in zero-G environments, and will still produce what we need from them, though we may need vast swaths of agricultural land within larger ships with larger crews. Food can also be stored and prepared for long shelf times, though this may weigh a ship down if it was unable to produce anything while in flight. Apologies, but my voice has changed in quality, and will do so again at the end of this video. But halfway through editing, I realized I had left out an important consideration when discussing personal starships: safety. When talking about upgrading the vehicles people drive in, safety is a priority. It's true that flying cars are always going to be the technology that everyone dreams of, but in all honesty, there are a lot of people who probably shouldn't be driving regular ones, let alone personal aircraft that can now fall for miles after a crash and land on something or someone. People have to study and test for car licenses, while pilots have to spend years and many thousands of dollars getting pilot licenses. If we want to put people into starships, they will require far more training and testing before they ever set foot in a capsule. Our modern-day astronauts spend decades of their lives learning all they can about their crafts, as well as how to operate and live safely aboard them. This obstacle of time may prove too difficult or impractical for the average Joe, and may relegate piloting privileges to the well-trained professionals. But we can also simplify our existing technology to reach the goal of consumer use. The first cars were a mess of dials, levers, and valves that controlled the various engine processes. They needed trained drivers to operate them, as even if someone knew how to drive, they would have difficulty learning the controls. Now, anyone can drive a car, as the finer controls have been assigned to internal computers or even just improved engine parts that regulate automatically. Levers and valves turned into two pedals, a steering wheel, and a key turn. What's to say this won't happen to spacecraft? There will be a limit to how much we could simplify, as the basic functions of a spacecraft will still need to complete advanced tasks using a multitude of reaction wheels, thrusters, tracking software, and landing equipment. With more moving parts and complexity, the margin for equipment failure will always rise, and precautions for emergency rescue need to be implemented in every spacecraft, just as cars have airbags and auto braking to reduce the risk of casualties if an accident occurs. But we won't be able to just step out of a wrecked spaceship and walk to safety. Space desperately wants to kill you in a variety of ways, and we will still need to keep the integrity of the cockpit intact if something happens to the ship. Your ship is also not going to grind to a halt if the engine explodes. The wreckage will continue to drift in the direction it was traveling and will do so at the same speed until it hits something, probably another planet or even another starship. The most probable safety precaution that will be implemented in most, if not all, future starships will be escape pods located in an area not close to equipment that would be susceptible to failure, such as the engines or oxygen storage. This would reduce the chances of these pods being destroyed in the same event that led to their need. These pods may even be the cockpit of the craft that could separate from the rest of the ship and propel itself away from the wreckage. These pods would need to be large enough for a crew to stay within comfortably for extended periods of time, while a rescue ship travels to their location. These pods would need to have the same life support systems in place as the rest of the ship, and may need to apply medical care or come stocked with life-saving equipment. A disaster in space would be hundreds of times more difficult for rescue to reach than even on Mount Everest. Survivors will need to wait days or even weeks for another ship to launch and reach their position, a daunting task for someone who has suddenly lost engine power while flying past the outer planets, which takes years to reach with our modern craft. This could be solved if we already had a large human presence around these distant worlds, something that may occur long before personal starships become viable. Now back to my previous level of vocal quality. Once we have solved these issues and have created the need for such vehicles, there really is no limit to what they could look like and do, much like the ground, water, and air-based ones we have today. Once a need is established, our features could look much like our fictions of today, and may be far more incredible than we can currently imagine. I can't see this occurring within my own lifetime, let alone within a few hundred years, but people who theorize about our future are more often than not completely wrong. I may not know when this future will happen, but I know that when it does, it will be something unimaginable. I hope you all enjoyed, and thank you for watching.